Hello and welcome back to the auditorium. We are ready for our next keynote speaker from Synopsys, Mr. Frank Morris. His keynote topic is the pace of change in the cybersecurity. Mr. Frank Morris is the managing director of EMA and APAC SIG Consulting, Synopsys. Can I please request Mr. Morris to join us on stage?
Thank you.
Hello, sir.
Hi. All right, are we good to go?
Yes, if you could just
Fantastic.
quickly present your screen and then the stage is all yours.
Brilliant, no problem. Okay.
Yes, there it is visible. The stage is all yours. I'll get off.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I hope you're having a fantastic day at the conference so far. And thank you all for the opportunity for being able to speak with you all. My name is Frank Morris. I'm the Managing Director for our EMEA and APAC regions here at Synopsys. And what I'd like to do today is just discuss a few things that people might want to consider in cybersecurity. And in particular, the pace of change that we're facing in a maturing cybersecurity environment. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with all the things that go on with digital transformation and all the change programs that happen. But when you're in an environment such as cybersecurity like we are now, we generally sit in a relatively immature environment that's constantly in a maturing state. But more importantly, there's so many changing variables going on. So I'd just like to discuss a few of those variables pretty much as a series of short stories. And with all of these things, it's important to understand that anything I say here is really just to give some guidance and direction from a personal opinion. I'm certainly not aiming to be a GPS to guide everyone through these things, but certainly just to give some opinions and direction. And the first thing I'd like to just cover is, that age-old premise, people, process, and technology. It still applies to all parts of our industry, but in particular in cybersecurity at the moment, people, process, and technology are still absolutely critical. But the difference is that we're on a moving platform these days of shifting sands. There's so many things going on that change. So I'm just going to talk through some of the stories that we see that impact all of those things in our environment. And the first thing I really wanted to do was get us to consider just how fast things are, just like this bunch of people that you see on the screen here. And, pace is moving incredibly fast in our industry. Things are moving all around us. But worse than that, most of the time, it feels very much like an obstacle course, because every time you start to pick up speed with things that are going on, something will get thrown in your way. It's that ever-changing thing whereby we've got huge amounts of complexity internally, huge amounts of complexity externally in terms of the threats that face us, and they're constantly changing. And you just look at some of the events that have taken place this week in our industry, you can see how quickly things go from running smoothly to being an absolute dilemma that everyone's got to face. Now, one of the first things I like to think that happen in our industry is that real challenge that we have around resources. And resources are not just about those in terms of trying to hide them from an external perspective, but we're constantly in a tug of war. And that tug of war is taking place between external parties, whether it's vendors and suppliers, but it's also taking place internally within organizations. So the big challenges that people are facing are competition for the same resources. How often do we see, while we're talking around things like DevSecOps, it's complications that are there from development teams, operation teams, security teams. Now we're all competing for the same resources. So there's a constant tug of war going on, and I'm sure that you all feel that. So something to be cognizant of when we're doing anything within our industry is how do we handle that change that's going on in terms of competition for resources. So showing some empathy with other departments, getting very strong shared goals, absolutely critical. All right, so huge amounts of internal competition, huge amounts of external competition going on. This picture here was my best representation of tectonic plates within our globe, and they are the shifting sands that we are standing on right now. Things are changing in terms of regulations that organizations have to deal with. They're changing every month, every year. There's always something new that's going on. So as regulations change, we're having to adapt in our organization for how to deal with those. Secondly, the threats, as I touched on earlier, are really evolving. You can see the threats that are going on because the people that are involved in those things, they are usually one step ahead. The threat actors that we're facing, usually one step ahead. And so there's constant challenge that goes on when we start to adapt and we start to mature in our organizations. something else will constantly pop up. You've got variations of tools that people can use, and being an organization that indeed sells and implements some of those tools into businesses, we see that day on day. The tools are developing constantly, the challenges are developing constantly. How on earth could we make decisions around those? The methods and approaches that you see nowadays are weekly. They're not annually anymore or every decade seeing a change. They are literally weekly. So those challenges are facing us continually. The big arrow here is a representation of everything that we hear around this term called shift left, a big term, right? What does it really mean? Well, in lots of organizations, obviously the basic premise makes some sense. Move things earlier into the life cycle of everything that you do, and this could apply to any industry. It makes a lot of sense. But in our industry, when you've got the challenges where you're facing resource shortages, skills shortages, and so forth, quite often it's perceived as just increasing the burden on one side, and therefore creating a huge imbalance in organizations. Picture on the right there is just trying to depict the fact that we need to create balance. So rather than constantly thinking about big terms like shifting left, start to think about sharing the burden across the organization, making sure that training is done effectively, and importantly here, education. Education. It's absolutely key to make sure that with organizations that we are working with, that the staff on the ground, the teams on the ground are fully educated in what expectations there are placed on them, who's responsible for what and how that is shared. But equally as important is the education of key stakeholders within business. So when we're seeing changes going on within our industry at the moment, absolutely key that the top stakeholders have an understanding. And just talk about that maturity and evolution within here in our business. It's probably only 4 or 5 years ago, and I spent some time myself as a CISO in a FTSE organization. A lot of that time was spent educating the board, making sure that the board understood what the risks were to the organization around cyber. That's now evolved in a lot of organizations, those have matured a little, into no longer just educating around the basics, but then educating around how to represent these things appropriately across business and how that flows down effectively into the organization in terms of getting all your staff engaged. So education is absolutely key right at the top of the tree, all the way through organizations to make sure that everybody's involved with cybersecurity understands what their role is that they have to play. Another common issue that I certainly see is this, and it's a picture of golf clubs. And the reason I put that up there is for those of you that do play golf, I'm sure you've all been out there and spent a lot of money buying a new set of golf clubs, thinking that when doing so, you're going to end up playing like Tiger Woods the very next day. This is a real rarity to happen. And it happens in business where we think in the cyber world, we can buy a tool or we can put in a new process or something else that absolutely changes the way in which we're going to operate. The reality is that just spending money on something like that isn't really going to help. And what we're trying to do as an organization, and we've seen work with businesses, is rather than selling the golf clubs, trying to actually work with organizations to give golf lessons, if you like, for how to play more effectively. And if we use that concept in our industry, particularly in cybersecurity, it gives people that opportunity to have a bit of consideration about what the impact is going to be when you're spending money on shiny new tools or shiny new things that are supposedly going to help the business. So I like to think of things in the context holistically about what is the impact, what is the change, what is the outcome you're trying to create in organizations. Now, all of these things, and I've thrown 10 various things within there in just a few minutes at you all in terms of things to consider, are just representative of most of you will recognize the fact that you're always trying to improve, and whatever rating or factoring we're using to measure that, whether it's on a scale of 1 to 5 or advanced, excellent, etc., we always have an aspiration to go one step better. But what we find in our industry is one of those rare ones that you can get to a level and then do nothing for a period of time, and you would find yourself deteriorating in terms of maturity. And it's one of the rare things that you get in the industry. Normally, when you get somewhere, you've pegged yourself at a certain level, and that's where you are for the future. In ours, if you stay still, you're actually moving backwards. And that's because the pace of change is so quick. So how do we overcome this in our business? And I often get questions saying, well, given that's the case, Frank, given that's the case in our industry, How on earth are we ever going to get there? It's such a big challenge. And one thing that I like to highlight is if we take a look at other industries, you'll be asking why I've put a sign up here around no hats, no boots, no high vis, no job. Well, if you go back 25 years into the construction industry, across the globe, everyone said, there was a real challenge around health and safety, a real challenge around the number of people that were getting injured or deaths indeed on construction sites. And the challenge was, how do we stop that? Most people in the industry said, well, if you try and put too many things in place to stop that, you're going to stop the industry moving forwards. Now, if you go to any site, pretty much globally, you'll see signs like this, and they're adhered to, and these things are deployed. It's taken a long time. It's taken 20 plus years to get there. And most people were laughed out of the water when people said, we can do this. Now, the things that made this work was accountability. So accountability then was undertaken by board members to say, we are the ones now at risk if something happens to our staff members. And when you do that, there was a massive impact around saying there will be 0 incidents on site. They've set extreme challenges that aren't always met, but they've set the challenge so far ahead. If you set the target to be 0 incidents, then actually you're going to get very close rather than just saying it can't be done. We have the same situation going on in our industry right now, which is to make sure that leadership are taking on board the seriousness of cybersecurity in business. We're starting to get there now. And as we continue to mature, I would expect us to start to see the same kind of conditions as we've experienced in other industries and evolving going forwards. So just in summary, a few thoughts to consider. And I appreciate throwing lots of information out there, but I discussed the basic premise of people, process, and technology. That still applies to everybody in our industry. But keeping pace with all of the variables, which are around skills and training, the internal competition that takes place there, the stakeholder management and skills and education of entire teams, being able to balance responsibilities across the organization, a real critical one for me, that is. How we're handling regulations and making sure we stay on top of those, and looking at how risk varies across the organization are all important variables that are going to be taking place for all of us to consider. There's no point looking for a magic bullet. I know it's cliched, but that set of golf clubs isn't going to make us play better. Think about what we're going to do holistically and what the outcomes are we're trying to achieve. And lastly, establishing maturity can be done. We should have confidence that it can be done when we look at other industries, but we also have to be bold about the aspirations we're trying to take within organizations around cybersecurity. So I'm going to stop talking there for a moment. I just don't want to go over time, but I'll pause for now and then give any opportunities if there are any questions or anything else that people would like to raise.